My dad's fiancée pointed at me in my own childhood home and said, "From now on, you'll be paying rent if you want to stay here." My dad stayed silent while she smirked, adding, "It's time you start pulling your weight." I looked around at the walls I grew up and gave an answer that changed everything. I, 32M, stood in the living room of my childhood home, staring at the woman who'd been in my father's life for barely 8 months. She had her arms crossed, that practiced smile on her face, the one she used when she wanted to seem reasonable while saying something unreasonable. Dad sat in his recliner, the same one he'd occupied for 20 years, looking anywhere but at me. She'd just told me I needed to start paying rent if I wanted to keep living here. In my own house. The house my mother had poured her heart into before cancer took her 3 years ago. The house where I'd moved back in to help Dad through his grief, to make sure he ate proper meals and didn't spend every evening staring at old photographs. "It's time I started pulling my weight," she said. Her smirk widened slightly as she waited for my response, clearly expecting me to either argue or comply. Dad remained silent, his jaw working like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the courage. I looked around at those walls, at the pencil marks on the doorframe where Mom had measured my height every birthday, at the spot where I'd accidentally put a dent in the drywall playing indoor hockey at age 12, at the kitchen where Mom had taught me to cook, where we'd spent countless Sunday mornings making pancakes. I took a deep breath and told them both I thought that was actually a great idea. We should definitely discuss rent and financial arrangements. But first, I suggested we sit down and go through some paperwork together. I had a few documents I thought we should review as a family. The woman's expression shifted slightly, uncertainty flickering across her features. Dad finally looked at me, confusion evident in his eyes. I excused myself to my room, the same room I'd had since childhood, and pulled out the file box I kept in my closet. Inside were documents I'd organized after Mom died, papers I'd filed away thinking they'd never matter. How wrong I'd been. When I returned to the living room, I set the box on the coffee table. The woman had taken a seat on the couch, her confidence apparently restored. She asked what all this was about, her tone suggesting I was wasting her time. I pulled out the first document, the deed to the house. I placed it on the table facing them and explained what they were looking at. The property deed, dated from 15 years ago, when Mom and Dad had refinanced. I pointed to the names on the deed. Mom's name, and my name. Dad sat forward, his brow furrowing. The woman's smirk vanished. I continued, explaining that Mom had insisted on it during the refinancing. She'd wanted to make sure I was protected, that I'd always have a stake in the family home. Dad had agreed, though honestly, I don't think he'd really thought about what it meant. At 22, I certainly hadn't understood the implications. It had just been Mom being Mom, always planning ahead, always protecting her family. So when we talked about rent, I said, I thought it was important to clarify who would be paying whom, since I owned 50% of this house. The silence that followed was profound. The woman's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on a mottled purple. She turned to Dad and demanded to know if this was true. He nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the deed. But I wasn't finished. I pulled out the next document. Bank statements. For the past 3 years, since I'd moved back in, I'd been paying the property taxes, the insurance, and covering half the utility bills. I'd kept meticulous records. I spread the statements across the table, highlighting the relevant transactions. I told them I'd been handling these expenses because Dad had been struggling after Mom died, and I'd wanted to help. I'd never mentioned it because it felt wrong to bring up money during his grief. But now that we were discussing financial contributions, I thought transparency was important. The woman started to speak, but I held up my hand. There was more. I pulled out the final document. Mom's will. I'd read it dozens of times in the years since her death, usually late at night when I missed her most. But there was one section I'd never discussed with Dad, one provision I'd never had reason to mention. I read aloud the relevant passage. In the event of her death, Mom's half of the house would transfer fully to me, but with specific conditions. Dad would retain right of residence for his lifetime, would never be asked to leave, and would always have a home here. However, any decisions about the property, including who else could live here, would require my approval as majority owner. Mom had protected us both. She'd made sure Dad would never be homeless, never be without the comfort of his own home. But she'd also made sure that no one could ever push me out of the place where I grew up. Dad's face had gone pale. He looked at the will, then at me, then at the woman beside him. I could see him doing the math, realizing what Mom had known, that he might someday meet someone who didn't have his best interests at heart. Or mine. The woman stood abruptly. She said this was ridiculous, that I couldn't just spring this on them, that we needed to discuss this properly. Her voice had lost its authoritative edge. Now she just sounded desperate. I remained calm. I told her there was nothing to discuss. These were the facts. The house was mine. I'd been more than generous in allowing Dad to live here rent-free, in covering expenses he should have been splitting with me. But if she wanted to start making demands about who paid what, then yes, let's have that conversation properly. I explained that as the majority owner, I could technically charge rent. Market rate for a 3-bedroom house in our neighborhood was running about $2,000 a month. I'd never dream of charging Dad anything. This was his home. But if we were going to start treating this like a landlord-tenant situation, as she'd suggested, then perhaps we should formalize the arrangement. She insisted Dad was the homeowner, that I couldn't just take his house. Her voice rose to a near shout. I corrected her gently. Dad was a part owner. Before Mom died. But Mom's share came to me. Dad had right of residence, but I owned 75% of the property. Simple math. Dad finally spoke. He asked me quietly if this was all true, if I'd really been paying those bills without telling him. His voice cracked slightly. I told him yes. I explained that after Mom died, I'd seen how much he was struggling. The bills were piling up. Things were getting overlooked. I just started handling them because it needed to be done, and I didn't want him to worry about it while he was grieving. I'd figured we were family, and family helped each other. I'd never imagined I'd need to itemize my contributions. The woman tried a different approach. She softened her voice and said she hadn't realized the situation, that obviously we needed to discuss this as a family, that maybe she'd been too hasty with her earlier suggestion. I nodded and agreed. We absolutely should discuss things as a family, which was why I wanted to make clear that I had no intention of charging Dad rent or making him feel uncomfortable in his own home. However, I also wanted to make clear that I wouldn't be pushed around or treated like a freeloader in a house I legally owned and financially maintained. I looked directly at her and said that if she planned to be part of this family, she needed to understand the reality of the situation. This wasn't Dad's house that I was crashing at. This was our house, mine and Dad's. And any decisions about who lived here or what financial arrangements existed would be made by the actual owners. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Then she grabbed her purse and announced she needed air. She left through the front door, not quite slamming it, but close. Dad and I sat in silence for a long moment. Then he asked me why I'd never told him about the expenses I'd been covering. His voice was thick with emotion. I explained that he was my father. After Mom died, he'd been so lost. I'd moved back because I was worried about him, because he needed support. The money wasn't important. What mattered was making sure he was okay, that he had someone looking out for him. I kept quiet about the finances because I didn't want him to feel indebted or guilty. I just wanted to help. He was quiet for another minute, staring at the documents on the table. Then he told me he'd had no idea about the deed, about Mom putting my name on it. He said Mom must have done it during the refinancing without making a big deal of it, and he'd just signed the papers his lawyer had prepared. He'd trusted her to handle the details. I told him that sounded like Mom. Always planning, always making sure we were protected. She must have known that life was unpredictable, that things could change. She'd wanted to make sure we were both taken care of, no matter what happened. Dad nodded slowly. Then he asked me what he should do about his fiancée. The way he said it, the word fiancée sounded uncertain, like he was questioning the title. I told him that was his decision to make. I wasn't going to tell him how to live his life or who to be with, but I also wasn't going to be disrespected in my own home, and I wasn't going to pretend I didn't have rights to protect myself. If she was going to be part of his life, she needed to understand that this family operated on mutual respect, not power plays. Dad asked me to give him some time to think. He needed to process everything, to figure out what he wanted. I told him to take all the time he needed. Update 1. It's been 2 weeks since that confrontation in the living room. I figured I should update everyone on what's happened since then. The fiancée came back to the house about 3 hours after she left that day. She was calmer, more controlled. She asked to speak with Dad privately. I gave them space, heading out to grab dinner and kill a few hours. When I got back, Dad was alone. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a beer, something I hadn't seen him do since before Mom got sick. He looked exhausted, but somehow lighter, like a weight had lifted. He told me they'd called off the engagement. Not broken up entirely, but put everything on pause. She'd admitted that she'd thought the house was entirely his, that she'd been planning to gradually push me out so they could have their space. She'd apparently seen me as an obstacle to her vision of their life together. Dad said he'd been blind to it. He'd been so lonely after Mom died, so desperate for companionship, that he'd ignored the warning signs. The small comments she'd made about me being too old to live at home. The suggestions that he should downsize to a smaller place. The way she'd started redecorating without asking, slowly erasing Mom's touches from the house. He apologized to me, his voice breaking. He said he'd let her disrespect me and disrespect Mom's memory because he'd been afraid of being alone again. I told him I understood. Grief makes us vulnerable, makes us grasp at anything that might ease the pain. I wasn't angry at him, but I was glad he'd seen the truth before things went further. He asked me if I'd known all along what she was doing. I admitted I'd had suspicions for a few months. The way she positioned herself as the authority in the house, the way she'd started making decisions without consulting either of us. But I'd held back because Dad had seemed happy, and I didn't want to ruin that for him. The incident with the rent demand had just been the final straw. I couldn't let it go unchallenged. Dad nodded and said Mom would have been proud of how I handled it. She'd always been the strategic one, the planner. Apparently, I'd inherited more from her than just her eyes. We spent the rest of the evening talking, really talking, for the first time in months. He told me about the loneliness, about how the house felt too empty without Mom in it. I told him about my own struggles with her loss, how coming home had been as much about my grief as his. We agreed to some changes. Dad insisted on starting to split the bills with me properly, said he couldn't let me carry the financial burden alone anymore. I tried to argue, but he was firm. So we set up a joint account for household expenses, both contributing equally. We also agreed to be more honest with each other. No more silent suffering. No more trying to protect each other from difficult truths. As for the ex-fiancée, she moved her things out over the following week. There were no dramatic scenes, no more confrontations. She was civil, almost subdued. On her last trip to collect her belongings, she actually apologized to me. She said she'd let her insecurity and desire for security override her better judgment, that she'd convinced herself she was doing what was best for Dad when really she'd just been thinking of herself. I didn't know if I believed her remorse was genuine, but I accepted the apology. There was no point in holding on to anger. Update 2. It's been 3 months now. Life has settled into a new normal that somehow feels more right than anything has in years. Dad joined a grief support group at the community center. He'd resisted for years, insisting he could handle things on his own, but that night we talked seemed to shake something loose in him. He started going to meetings twice a week, and the change has been remarkable. He talks about Mom now without that haunted look in his eyes. He's even started laughing again. Real laughs, not the hollow sounds he'd been making before. We've started a tradition of Sunday dinners, just the two of us. We cook together, trying out Mom's old recipes and attempting new ones. We're both terrible at her pot roast, but we're getting better. Last week, we actually managed her stuffed peppers without setting off the smoke alarm. The house feels different now, less like a shrine to the past and more like a living space again. We repainted the living room, keeping Mom's color choice but freshening it up. We went through some of her things together, boxing up items to donate, while keeping the pieces that meant the most. It was painful but necessary. Dad's also started dating again, but slowly and with much more awareness. He met a woman at the grief support group, a widow who lost her husband 2 years ago. They've been on a few coffee dates. He's being careful, thoughtful. He actually talks to me about it, asks my thoughts. Not because he needs my permission, but because he values my perspective. I've told him I just want him to be happy, but also to be smart. To not rush into anything out of loneliness or fear. As for me, the whole situation has given me clarity about my own life. I'd been in a holding pattern since Mom died, putting my own plans on pause to take care of Dad. But now I realize that's not what Mom would have wanted. She'd put my name on that deed to give me security, not to trap me in place. I've started looking into job opportunities in the city, about 2 hours away. Better positions, better pay. Dad's encouraged me to go for it. Insists he's stable enough now that I don't need to worry about him. We've talked about me keeping my room here as a home base while renting an apartment in the city for work. The house is big enough, and it would give me flexibility. But the most unexpected development came last month. I was going through some of Mom's old papers, things I'd boxed up but never fully sorted, when I found letters. Dozens of them, written by Mom during her final months but never sent. They were addressed to both Dad and me, labeled by date with instructions about when to read them. I'd apparently missed them during the initial sorting after her death. They'd been in a folder marked insurance papers, Mom's idea of hiding them in plain sight until we were ready. I sat down with Dad, and we read them together. Mom had written about her hopes for us, her fears about leaving us. She'd written about the house, explaining why she'd structured things the way she had. She'd known Dad would be vulnerable in his grief, might make decisions out of loneliness rather than wisdom. She'd wanted to protect him from being taken advantage of, but she'd also wanted to make sure I had a foundation, a place to return to no matter what life threw at me. In one letter, she wrote that she hoped we'd take care of each other, that we'd be honest with each other even when it was hard. She'd known we'd both try to be strong and independent, but she'd wanted us to remember that needing each other wasn't weakness, it was family. Dad cried reading that letter. So did I. There was one letter specifically for me, dated for when someone tries to take what's yours. Mom had apparently anticipated something like the fiancé situation. In it, she told me to stand firm, to not let anyone diminish my worth or my place in the family. She reminded me that she'd raised me to be strong but also kind, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply stand your ground with quiet confidence. She'd ended that letter by telling me she loved me, that she was proud of the man I'd become, and that she knew I'd know what to do when the time came. Reading those words, I realized that everything that had happened, the confrontation, the documents, the way I'd handled it, had been shaped by her. She'd taught me to be prepared, to protect myself and those I loved, but to do it with dignity. Final update. 6 months have passed since that day in the living room. I'm writing this final update from my new apartment in the city, though I'm heading back to the house this weekend for Sunday dinner. I took the job in the city. It's been good for me. Challenging work, new people, a sense of moving forward rather than staying stuck in the past. But I go home every other weekend, and Dad and I talk on the phone several times a week. The distance has actually strengthened our relationship rather than weakening it. Dad's still seeing the woman from the grief group. It's been 5 months now, and things are progressing slowly. She's kind, thoughtful, and most importantly, she respects both Dad and me. She's never once tried to change the house or push boundaries. When Dad mentioned possibly having her move in someday, he immediately clarified that he'd discuss it with me first, that it would be a family decision. I told him I appreciated that, but also that he didn't need my permission to be happy. The house was there for him to live in and enjoy. My only request was that any partner he brought into his life understood and respected what we'd built together. The honesty, the mutual support, the memory of Mom. The house itself has become something different now. It's not just the place where I grew up or the place where Mom died. It's a foundation, just like she intended. Dad has his life there. I have my place in the city. But we both know that home, real home, isn't just about ownership or location. It's about the people who matter, the connections that hold when everything else falls apart. Sometimes I think about that moment when the ex-fiancé told me to pay rent. How angry I'd felt, how disrespected. But now I'm almost grateful for it. It forced a confrontation that needed to happen. It brought truths to light that had been lurking in shadows. It pushed Dad and me to really communicate, maybe for the first time since Mom died. Last month, on what would have been Mom's birthday, Dad and I sat in the living room where everything had gone down. We looked through old photo albums, told stories, laughed at memories. At one point, Dad turned to me and thanked me for standing up that day, for not backing down, for protecting what Mom had built for us. I told him I'd only done what she'd taught me to do. Stand firm, but be fair. Protect yourself, but lead with truth rather than anger. Know your worth, but never use your power to diminish others. Those documents I'd pulled out that day are back in their file box in my old room. I hope I never need them again. But if I do, they're there. And more importantly, the lesson behind them remains. Preparation isn't paranoia. Boundaries aren't cruelty. And standing up for yourself doesn't make you the villain. Mom knew what she was doing when she put my name on that deed. She wasn't just giving me property. She was giving me agency, security, and a lesson about protecting what matters. I look around at the walls I grew up in, and the answer I gave that day still echoes. This is my home, and no one gets to take that from me.